All right, so thank you very much, Terry, for that anecdote on using analytics responsibly and for challenging all of us in this room to think a little bit outside of the box, because all too often analytics is used to advance the bottom lines of most businesses and industries, but there's clearly an opportunity for us to be using it for the greater good. And in that same sort of thought, we're going to have our first panel, which will be moderated by Sean O'Brien, who is the Associate Vice President at LoyaltyOne. And on the panel, we're going to have a few guests here. Dr. Devin Singh, who is a physician, lead clinical artificial intelligence and machine learning at SickKids Hospital. We also have Parinaz Sobhani, who is a director of machine learning at Georgian Partners. We also have Michael Proulx, who is a director of research products at Sustainalytics. And lastly, Vic Pant, who is a chief science advisor at Natural Resources Canada and senior technical advisor at Mars Discovery District. All right, so can we have our panel up here and our moderator?
Good morning, everyone. Michelle made a very big mistake by giving me this mic for an hour. Welcome. Thank you, Terry, for that great keynote speech. It was truly inspiring, and it's great to hear about all the things that CIBC is doing to kind of further AI for good, data for good. I thought we'd start quickly with having our panelists introduce themselves. Maybe a minute or two about your path and your passions, starting with Devin.
Sure. My name is Devin. I'm an emergency physician at SickKids Hospital. I'm also the lead for the emergency department for artificial intelligence, machine learning, and data science. And I'd say sort of my main research endeavor and sort of pursuit for these next 10 years at least is to try and figure out how to use artificial intelligence in a clinical healthcare environment to really solve some of the problems that we see on a day-to-day basis, really at like a grassroots level. So throughout my training at SickKids, particularly throughout residency, you really encounter a lot of interesting healthcare problems, whether it's a logistical dilemma or a patient outcome that you think could have been better. And those moments have really lit up a bit of a fire in me to figure out how do we solve these problems. It's only until recently, actually, this guy's brother at a wedding, when I was sort of venting about these issues that I was encountering, said, hey, why don't you think about machine learning and artificial intelligence? And so I really knew nothing about computer science or programming. And over the last 5 years, I've dove into that field and realized that there's a lot of opportunity to solve complex problems by leveraging this technology. And then sort of before all of that, I did my medical school over at the University of Sydney in Australia, which was a wonderful time, and then a medical sciences degree over at Western. And I dabbled in some government stuff prior to med school and some startup stuff, and don't need to really go in too much about that. But sort of, yeah, that's a little bit about me.
My whole career and education has been focused on understanding how machines learn and perceive our world. I started working on machine learning and AI more than 10 years ago back in Iran when it was anything but hot. And I found it as a lazy programmer very fascinating, like that you don't need to specify all the steps anymore. Like you can let the machine figure it out. And so far, it has been a great journey applying machine learning and AI on very different kinds of problems. I've worked in Microsoft Research, working on machine translation, end-to-end neural network machine translation, National Research Council of Canada, working on natural language understanding, sentiment analysis and opinion mining, and now in Georgian Partners, helping our portfolio companies, startup companies. And we have a pretty diverse portfolio. We have companies working on clean energy, education, and so many other markets and businesses. Yep.
I'm Mike Proulx. My background starts back in the late 80s. in commodity futures. And I had a career 2 decades into now the 3rd decade from debt capital markets. Was at CIBC, where our keynote speaker was, running the bond portfolio. So my approach and introduction into analytics comes from the investment side. I went back to school after the financial crisis, as a lot of us did in the industry, and did a master's at the Monk School at the University of Toronto, where my thesis was conflict risk management for the mining sector, where I was looking to quantify and monetize CSR budgets and doing good, the prospects of doing good, and how do we spin that into the argument that this is business is good because it actually generates money if that's what we need to do. It's nice to have the kumbaya moments and let's all be good about talking to business. They kind of need to see the bottom line. So this was an expansion of the idea of the triple bottom line. That has led me into Sustainalytics, where that's sort of our business model and our value prop. We are a large ESG risk rater that looks to do this for our clients, standardize, monetize, and quantify the environmental, social, and governance aspects of their investment portfolios.
Great. Hi, everybody. My name is Vic. And when they were introducing me, I think they mentioned 2 organizations I'm associated with. I'll come to that in a minute. But I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of ABD. I think it's a great event. And I'd also like to thank my co-panelists and the moderator, Sean, Devin, my friend Pari, and then Mike. So very happy to be here. So presently, I'm a senior technical advisor at Mars, where I work with startups, mostly, also some corporates, but mostly startups, and advise them on everything from product strategy as it relates to taking data and then building AI solutions that they can commercialize and monetize. But also, I work quite extensively with universities and Vector Institute and so on and so forth to bring some of that research into these startups. My entire career has been in the enterprise software business industry. I worked at Oracle for 9 years. I worked at SAP for 3 years, OpenText for a couple of years. And I never imagined that I'd actually end up in the government. But recently, I was approached by the Government of Canada to take on the role of a Chief Science Advisor at the Ministry of Natural Resources. And that job is basically a combination of a Chief Scientist role and a Chief Science Officer role. And for me, I mean, as I mentioned, since I've always been in the private sector, I've always worked for huge enterprises or supported small startups. For me, what won me over was when they gave me a preview of the types of deep learning, reinforcement learning, and deep reinforcement learning types of projects and the alliances that now they're building with the Vector Institute, Amy, and Mila. So that's really what kind of struck me, and I said, okay, maybe this is a career path that I should consider, if not for my whole career, but certainly for the next couple of years. So that's why you heard Mars as a senior technical advisor of applied AI, but now also a chief science advisor at NRCan, which starts sometime in the middle of next month.
Perfect. Obviously a very experienced and distinguished panel. So we're going to try to bounce between both technical and kind of like philosophical topics, I think, as we go here. And I'm going to try to steer the pot as we go and try to get a good debate going. Let's start with use cases. What's an example, Devin, of a good use case at SickKids? And how do you balance the value that you need to create for the organization versus the good you're trying to do?
There's many good use case examples actually that come to mind, which is what gives me pause. But I'll try and describe a handful of them actually, because I find them all very exciting. So just all of our use cases usually center around a problem, and like a really human problem. And so take a patient coming to the emergency department who appears relatively well initially when they come, but then unfortunately due to a prolonged stay in the department, whether it's wait times or just a really busy day, deteriorates and then becomes really unwell. And then imagine if that patient actually dies, sort of what happens and the consequences of that for a family. And I think if we think about that particular problem, and these things happen in hospitals across Canada, and so they're really impactful for us as physicians, especially when logistics sometimes plays a role into an adverse outcome for a patient. So if we think about that problem, when we break it down into all of the different components, obviously those are where our use cases come from. So one of the use cases that we're working on is taking provider or physician efficiency matching it to a predicted patient volume, and trying to understand how to build a schedule in a really smart way so that we have the right doctors working at the right time of day, such that we don't see prolonged wait times building up? Or is there a way that in real time we can predict when a surge of patients is going to arrive to the emergency department and preemptively call in physicians, or just sort of do things to make sure that that wait time doesn't back up? So that's one particular logistics use case.
A follow-up question. Change management in enterprises seems to be, a big topic of discussion. How is that being handled at SickKids? Do you have, in my mind, or at least I'm envisioning, a 67-year-old old crotchety doctor who's like, no way I'm coming in Tuesday at 9 a.m. How does that play out in?
You're stirring the pot right from the beginning. Well, I would say particularly, I think I'm fortunate because the culture at SickKids is a very innovative one. So this particular old crotchety doctor that you're describing was once an innovator, and that's the reason why he or she has been there for so long and has maintained a position there. And so I think the philosophy within the organization is very open to these types of things, which is really important. Imagine if, we have a model, for example, not clinically in use right now, but that can predict, if a patient is going to have a cardiac arrest. But, no one's really studied, this is an understatement, I bet there are studies out there, but, there's no clear guideline on how do you act on a model that tells you a patient may have an adverse outcome, but the patient looks fine in front of you. So what do you do with that information, right? And so I think the doctors that you're describing are sort of wondering, well, now how do we solve this new challenge? And so you can get a bit of resistance there, but I wouldn't call it resistance. I would say it's sort of pushing the envelope and pushing the bar of clinical artificial intelligence research to get to a point where it really should be. So I don't really have a huge change management dilemma. I'm very well supported, fortunately, which may be different in other organizations, but I think that's just the SickKids way, and it's the philosophy. So I'm a bit lucky on that standpoint. My colleagues may have a different experience, though.
So just kind of going down the line here, I'm wondering, from a Georgian partner's perspective, I know, obviously most people know who Georgian is, but what's really cool is the trust piece of your portfolio, and in particular, the investments that you've made in-house with incredible individuals like yourself. Maybe you could talk about some of the products and use cases that you're working through. Myself in particular, the differential privacy piece is really, really cool.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that. I guess when we can start with the exciting part, which is the use cases, and then we can talk about barriers and bottlenecks, and then maybe we can talk about, for example, privacy is a big issue that we have, and then we can talk about differential privacy. But speaking of use cases, in our portfolio, as I said, we have Sentient Science. This company offers predictive analytics for wind turbines, or any assets in wind farms. And you can imagine that you ask about business value. So basically, by providing predictions about, for example, in 6 months, one of your turbines going to fail, and providing recommendation and suggestion how we can fix it in advance, you can both create business value, and of course it's for social good, because clean energy, of course, can solve one of the biggest battles we have with environmental issues, especially climate change. One other example that I particularly worked on is I worked with Top Hat, one of our portfolio companies based in Toronto. They offer educational softwares for universities and schools. And basically, one of the things that really I think is important to think about is how we can make our teachers more efficient and more productive. Because there are so many important things that teachers can focus on. For example, focusing on customizing teaching materials or even teaching styles for especially students with special needs. And how can we make them more efficient? How can we, it can be, so basically what we provided is kind of recommendation system that they can find relevant materials to their course materials on the Top Hat marketplace. And basically by using those contents, for example, the decks, exams, quizzes, anything that is already some other teachers have already created and they can reuse rather than starting from scratch. So basically by making teachers more productive, I think it's also a very good example of AI for social good. or analytics for social good. The other project I worked on is for Turnitin. I don't know how many of you have used Turnitin. It's mainly, they provide softwares for plagiarism detection for universities and schools, K-12 schools. And basically, again, it's about making teachers more productive by providing automatic kind of correction or marking of essays. So, and also like they also provide like how we can avoid kind of cheating by providing softwares. So these are kind of examples, and they are all like in a private sector. So these businesses are actually one of the most successful businesses of our portfolio companies as well, but they are also good for the society.
Great. Michael, how do we create the right balance in your business?
So this is a really good question for me and for Sustainalytics, because this is our value prop and our business model. So a good use case. I'm director on research products, but specifically responsible for mining and metals and forestry and pulp and paper, those sectors. If you recall, back in January, there was a tailings dam collapse in Brazil, and about 300 people lost their lives. So this is a significant, what we call material impact on the company that was very much raised and heightened the awareness of the investment community. So there are about $100 trillion of assets under management around the world. Only 26% of them have an ESG filter or screening applied to it. So that is your pension funds, that is your investment funds, that's your RRSP, that is all of that stuff. So one of the things you can do is start to ask that of your investment advisors. But what we do at Sustainalytics, and going back to this tailings dam, is we've got the push from the investment community, our subscribers, that said, what are you doing about this? Thanks for letting us know. How can we better analyze this and be made aware of it? So we have created, we're just in the process of finishing the development of a indicator inside our larger methodology. We'll insert it in there. And this is the opportunity where Sustainalytics gets to be, previously we were a bit of a stick to companies by saying, you know, you're poor on the environmental side, or poor on the social side, or poor on the governance side. And if you can imagine mining, the stories are littered across time, even recently. So I'll go back to same with Brazil. And the tailings collapse. So we've come up with this indicator, and it gives us the opportunity to also be a carrot. So we go and talk to the issuers, the mining companies, and say, we're coming up with this indicator that is going to rate and rank the BATs and the BAPs, the best available technologies and the best available practices. So we get to instruct them on what the investment community is looking for to help reduce their risk, and this leads to better enterprise valuations, better risk adjustments, and hopefully at the end saves lives down the road. The company that was targeted, Vale in the Brazil dam collapse, has now moved and said they're in the process of no longer using upstream tailings. I won't get into the weeds on that, but that was an issue. And they are now going to stop using upstream tailings and have all downstream tailings. And that's a significant move on the company side, and hopefully saves lives at the end of the day.
For this indicator, would your organization consider making that like public? Like publishing all of the results and the rankings of the companies to say, this is what a great company looks like, this is what an average company looks like, this is what a developing company looks like?
And that's really good, and that's one of the metrics that we use in developing the indicator. We don't need the company to tell us that this is what they're doing, because sometimes that's not the case. So one of the metrics that we have is the data publicly available so that it can be verified or checked, or we use NGOs, we use civil society organizations, exactly the ones that Terry was talking about earlier, and I think Parinaz was talking about now. So these are other sources of information publicly available that we do. The specific recipe inside it, sure, there's nothing public about it. It's all publicly available, and what the standards are. And we've just ranked and graded the standards. and interesting. We expect, at least at the start, because we do have a bit of a statistical model, and we are looking for orthogonality, and we're looking for distribution of outcome scores. So we figure there's going to be a hard skew because 80% of them we expect aren't going to be able to meet the top of the standard and get the best score on it. But hopefully, we're expecting that will slowly change and become a normal distribution over time. And then that would show the success that we had at being a carrot as well as being a stick.
Great. Vic, as you move into this new role at the government, how do you plan to balance? What's your plan for, and probably it's still developing, but what are some of your early thoughts on how we balance this innovation and how do we point it in the right direction to help make the lives of Canadians better?
Great, thanks. That's a great question. So I think when it comes to the government, already they're driven by that public welfare, social good motive. So that is always a filter. For example, when government selects or prioritizes projects, that is definitely something they look at. So I'll give you 3 examples. When I was being given a bit of a preview of the types of initiatives that are going on, one of the interesting projects that is going on in the government is done by the Canadian Forestry Service, where they use drone imagery and they use satellite imagery to predict the outbreak of invasive species when it relates to, for example, things that can destroy trees and canopies and so on and so forth. And a very interesting then transfer application of that is in then applying that to the waterways to predict in case there's a flood, the way that the flood is going to spread. And so that's an interesting application of technology that in the past was either not possible or in fact it was possible through the manual updating and synchronization of various kinds of rules. So that's one interesting example. In the public health space, they're using text mining and social media analytics to perhaps detect certain onset of certain types of contagions, where for example, certain communities are talking about similar symptoms and so on and so forth. So can they take a more proactive kind of an intervention to help mitigate further spread of some kind of medical outbreaks? And also on the financial side, a lot of the anti-money laundering or tax fraud, those kinds of things used to be done in the context of manually encoded rules, and then which are obviously very difficult to adapt over time because people who are doing this are smart. They're also doing creative accounting. So now they're using actually some interesting algorithms to come at it from another angle. One of the things in all of these examples, though, is that, and to your question around how do we balance, is the balance comes not from using a light switch approach, not from using a big bang approach where it's like, okay, well, we were doing this with humans, and now all of a sudden we've got this deep reinforcement learning network that is hitting certain performance metrics. It's still very much in the government a human first, human oversight, human controlled sort of an intervention. And they take more of a gradient approach to it rather than a step approach to it. And I think that's how they balance it. They have economists, they have policy advisors, they have elected officials, they have very, very smart people who have a lot of domain knowledge and subject matter expertise. And they're the ones who ultimately decide if and when to take something from a pilot to a proof of concept to a prototype to a production system, and even then what the scope of that is. And ultimately it's the humans who are still in control.
Great. So what I'm taking from that is Vic's going to use AI to reduce all of our taxes. Kidding aside, it's really great to hear about the innovations happening at the government, and congratulations on your appointment. It's an incredible opportunity. Pivoting slightly, governance, our favorite word in this room. Data governance, AI governance. Let's start with data. Who owns it? Is it the organizations? Is it the individuals? Is it the patients, the stakeholders? Devin, what's your opinion?
There probably is a right and wrong answer to this, which concerns me. I think I'm going to say patients own their data. I mean, it's sort of how we think about it in the hospital, right? And one of the initiatives that through an electronic health record system that SickKids is now implemented is really making sure patients have access to their data in a semi-real-time fashion, which I think is really important. Like, you know, just on a human level, you go to a doctor, you get a test, and then you're wondering what the result of that test is, and no one calls you, so you just assume that it's normal. And usually it's always normal in those instances, but to be able to see your data and to feel like you own that data by by at least being able to visualize it, I think is really important. But when you think about, okay, well, we're going to use this data to build a model, and then that model is going to, possibly drive beneficial outcomes and maybe be commercialized. I personally believe in a hospital space that if we are going to create sustainable initiatives in clinical artificial intelligence, there does need to be a commercialization element to simply drive sustainability and then further innovation. But at the core of that initiative isn't about building huge profits and building this giant tech company out of healthcare data. It's really about using funds and that sustainability to spread that social benefit further. So if an initiative just starts locally at the hospital and now we're able to positively impact all patients in the hospital, how do we then spread that to other community hospitals? Or how do we bring that to northern Canada in a sustainable way? Or how do we bring that globally? And that's sort of the pursuit that we're on. And I think if you do that in that way, or if you think about your projects in that way, I think you're always giving that ownership to people. Whether there's governance in place to mandate that or not. Like, I think if that's your guiding philosophy, at least from a healthcare perspective, of truly improving the healthcare of children globally, and that's really the pursuit, governance or not, your project will be giving citizens ownership of their data.
It's what a great mission. So you took it exactly where I hope you would take it, which is great. So from data onto analysis. So there's a professor out of Oxford. Her name is Dr. Sandra Wachter. She released a paper last year about the right to reasonable inferences. And in this big data space, who owns the inferences, who owns the AI, and more importantly, it was about understanding why a prediction was made and the explainability of it. I love to keep going down and wonder if what your perspective is on this.
That's a great question. So exactly when I wanted to talk about the barriers. And when we talk about barriers, one of them is explainable AI. Like what really, because we all talk about very exciting initiatives and possible use cases, or like the actual use cases. And we all know like the AI and analytics can really help our societies and people. But why we don't see as many use cases as we expected. And as one of the most important one is data, as you mentioned, then data privacy, who is the owner of the data, and is there enough incentives for different stakeholders to share their data? And what are, and you said one of the reasons is that from business perspective, maybe it's not very reasonable to share your data because it's kind of your IP. Data is the new IP. So like there are lots of questions like this, and then privacy, like for sure, privacy is a big issue. Speaking of healthcare, actually, data in healthcare is very, very, very sensitive, and most of the time it's not about. Most likely hospitals don't want to they might want to like have sustainable businesses, but it's not really making money out of those data. The main problem is the privacy and actually data rights. Even hospitals, they don't have the right to make their patients' data publicly available. So how we can solve these kinds of issues using the same technology? So like, can we use technology to help technology? That's what we want to use. And yeah, for techniques like differential privacy, you talk about it, homomorphic encryption or federated learning. These are technologies that can enable data sharing or like some kind of framework like blockchain. So like they are possibilities. And that it makes me really happy, and it encouraged me that there is room to improve. Speaking of explainability, normally I guess 2 years ago, or even now, maybe in our committee, machine learning committee, if we talk about explainability, lots of people would say why we should focus on explainability. We can only focus on improving the performance of our machine learning systems. And it's kind of interesting discussion why people don't like to talk about explainability, because the definition of explainability by itself is kind of ambiguous. And in science, we like to have very clear mathematical definition for everything. And when we can't provide such definition, we try to not touch those kinds of problems. So like one of the problems is that when we talk about explainability, we have to think about who's going to use that kind of explanation. And are developers going to use those explanations? Are the end users going to use those explanations? And when we are dealing with humans, then we are dealing with different cognition. We are dealing with cognition limitations, right? So like if you all heard about deep neural networks. And lots of people say these are black box systems. But I can argue here that even a linear system, even a simple regression can be also black box for us. Why? Because imagine you have thousands of parameters or thousands of weights. Then as humans, if I put you in front of a linear system with thousands of weights, you really can't understand it. Or it may take a couple of hours or several hours from you. And it, again, depends on person to person. Maybe people with different cognition abilities might have different opinion about the explainability of this system. So even deep neural networks, for me, it's not a black box. I don't believe there is any black box in AI or machine learning. There, again, technology can help us. There are lots of, there are lots of research going on in our community that enables us to understand the rationale of the models, the machine learning systems. So again, I don't believe it's a barrier. It's again an opportunity, but it's hard. You have to think about your users. You have to think about the actual application. Why do you need explainability? There are several different reasons we need explainability. One of them is actually when we talk about augmentation, combining human intelligence and machine intelligence, actually we need explainability to enable augmentation. Why? Because we know that both human and machines, they have strengths and their weaknesses. So how we can combine it? If we want to combine these two sources of intelligence, we need to provide information to human. How did the machine make such decisions? And another one is that one of the other reasons, especially when we talk about healthcare applications, normally in machine learning, everything is about correlation. So like there is no way, at least most of the current technology is not about causality. It's all about correlation. In healthcare, we normally care about causality rather than correlation. So like having for example, living in a polluted city and having a cancer, it's a correlation. Did really pollution caused cancer or not? It's a question mark, and normally machine learning cannot, at least with the current technology, cannot answer such question. So again, explainability can help us to understand if there is, especially providing information for the humans in the loop. So there are, I'm so excited. Whenever I think about all the possible applications of AI and how explainability particularly can help to solve our problems, I get super excited. Again, we shouldn't think of these systems as black box. There is no black box. These are all about numbers, weights, and there is a way to transfer. So it's of course we are in the mathematical space, of course we are in a nonlinear space, but we can translate from that nonlinear space to a space that our human or our cognition can actually understand it.
It's great, and I love how you talk about the distribution of explainability. I think even amongst data scientists, if you're first starting out and you go into feature engineering, feature selection, and you're like, well, why'd you select this? And you're like, oh, well, XGBoost told me these are the best features. Yeah. And then you go through the rest of the process, and then over time you develop the experience and intuition and more rigor around it. But I love that point, because even imagine if you were applying for a bank loan and you were declined because of a black box. Like, try explaining that to someone who has no basis in this. Very, very difficult, right? I also love correct me if I'm wrong, but the differential privacy piece, that was developed at Georgian, right? Yeah. When you folks get a chance, check out, I think it was released at TensorFlow in the last, in the last release. So check it out. It's a Georgian created piece. It's super cool. Check it out when you have some time on your spare break. It's such a novel approach to machine learning, and it shows the investment that Georgian and the team are making in privacy.
It's very quick like a quick introduction to differential privacy, maybe it's going to be like, I don't want it to feel like it's like something very advanced. Of course, it has all the guarantees. When we talk about privacy, most of you have heard about the identification. So basically, removing the sensitive information from data, but it's not enough. Believe me, it's not enough. You need to have, because it doesn't provide mathematical guarantees. When we talk about homomorphic encryption or differential privacy, the main advantage of these technologies is that they provide mathematical guarantees. And we really can't risk the privacy of our patients, for example, and it's very clear by now that machine learning models, they can memorize the data they have been trained on. So imagine you have used your patient information to train your machine learning system who predicts, I don't know, whatever, and then these systems can be reverse engineered to get access to the individual's data point that has been trained on. So basically, by adding some randomization, by adding noise to your system in a principled way, because we don't want to sacrifice the utility of our systems. We don't want to make them useless, but at the same time, we want to provide mathematical guarantees that these systems cannot be reverse engineered to get access to the individual's data. Differential privacy is all about it.
Very cool. Check it out. It's really cool. So we're talking about kind of a little bit of an abstraction here, right? Like data, privacy, the rights of individuals. The Canadian government, I'm sure you all have recently read about, is the Digital Charter. Vic, as we start to, I know this isn't exactly your area, but you're well versed in this space. That's some really innovative thinking from the government as far as digital rights, privacy rights. How do you expect something like this will play out? How do you see contributing in your role to all of the data assets and AI assets that the government has?
Definitely. So there's a couple of different things. There's the Digital Rights Charter. There's also a digital data strategy for the government. Each department is also expected to adapt that to their nuances. And also, this is something that's mirrored now in the private sector as well. I noticed at Mars that generally with startups, there used to be, the startups used to all have this reflexive desire to own all the data, like own everything, because that's all they've ever learned is data is the new oil, so own, be a data harvesting organization. And then what I've started to notice is that the more nuanced organizations, startups, are actually now talking not so much about data ownership, but this notion of data trusts. And so that's something that has become quite prevalent amongst I would argue, the higher performing startups that I deal with at Mars, in that they're not now obsessed about just owning data. It's that, okay, maybe some of our models are trained on first-party data, other parts of our model are trained on third-party data. Maybe there's something in the middle, like second-party data. So, and this is something that I know is sort of triggered by and motivated by public-private partnerships, where the government has done some research on the utility of data trusts. In Europe, they have something called the International Data Space, run by the Fraunhofer Institute. Element AI recently released a paper on data trust. So this notion of data trust has become very, very pivotal to the operationalization of a digital rights charter or a digital data strategy for the government or for startups and corporations, whereby conversations that are now taking place are more nuanced than simply saying, I'm a startup or I'm a government agency, I want to own everything. It's that, okay, well, we're not going to be able to own every single thing that we need to have to build a rich representation of a data set that we can train these accurate models on. So maybe we need to have mature conversations about distributed ownership of data and then proper contracting in place and trust mechanisms in place so that the right people can access the data for the right reasons in the right way. And so I feel that the government is playing a big role in this from a regulatory perspective, from a policy perspective, from an encouragement perspective. But ultimately, I think a lot of this work also has to be done in large corporations and startups alike and supported by academic institutions and research organizations.
Great. So as we go global, Michael, what are some of the, in your opinion and with your enterprise, what are some of the biggest challenges that we can start to take bites out of from a data for good, AI for good perspective? Obviously, Terry highlighted some, but in your opinion, what are some of the great things we need to start tackling?
Okay, that's a large question. And just listening to the fellow panelists, they've got things to add in. all the way across, but I thought if you'll just permit me one moment, I wrote down something here. So I'm going to paraphrase a prayer that maybe you're all familiar with. I think it's St. Thomas's prayer, but I've reworked it a little bit for the audience and the thinking. And that is, data grant me clarity to understand the correlations that surround me and my regressions, empirical validity to establish visions and values, and a null hypothesis to note the difference. So it's, I think when we are looking at and that's sort of, you wanted to get the higher calling, I think Michelle led us towards. So I kind of go that direction. Back to your question, it's really anything, and it's really everything. I'm at a bit of a loss for words as to how to even get into it. I sort of have the notes here for the second question, and you've thrown me off because you haven't quite got there, but it gets into what can companies do.
I told you I was going off script.
Yeah, well, and you did, so good on you. What companies can do, continually to link these ideas, the learning aspects that is coming out of AI that we're doing as well to model, but also being aware that the models have limitations. I always tell a bit of a story about baseball. And last year, the Blue Jays didn't have a particularly good year, but they did set a major league record that had stood since 1908. And that was the most home runs hit off of 3-0 pitches. So think about that distribution. 95% of the batters in Major League Baseball don't take the bat off their shoulder on a 3-0 pitch. And Toronto, the Blue Jays had the green light and hit more home runs than anybody had off of 3-0 pitches for 110 years. And I think I use that as an example of what the good side is. If we're looking at low probability, high impact events, those are some of the things that I analyze, and I'm all about the distributions in the tail. And not that we want everything to be within 2 standard deviations or 3 standard deviations or your sigma 6, but what happens in the tail. And mostly it's a negative correlation. I'm saying, how does that spin into something positive? And I use the example of the Blue Jays, and the one example was they actually won the game. They were down against Boston in the 7th inning, and he swung at a 3-0 pitch and hit the home run, and we won the game. So I don't know if that necessarily answers your question, but I think there's a positive way of looking at the data, and this is the analytics side. I think that Parinaz was talking about in the predictability and giving us insights, and it goes back to what I was saying, clarity on the correlations and the regressions, the empirical validity to change things, the visions and the values that we have, and then to be able to know what the difference is and make sure that we're pursuing the right thing.
You brought us back on script. Thank you. So ensuring that we're focusing on the right things, regulation. How do we regulate these systems? How do we regulate the investment that goes into them? What role should government, enterprises, and individuals play in this? We'll come back to Devin.
I think in a healthcare space, regulation is going to be very important. How you go about building the regulation for these sort of evolving, innovative models is really difficult because there's a lot of opportunity to really accelerate forward and improve the way we deliver care. So you don't want to add regulation that stifles that excitement and that stifles that progress. But at the same time, again, sort of my mantra for the day, what I'm realizing now is thinking about the real human element to everything you do when it comes to machine learning AI. And at the end of the day, regulation can sometimes feel like a bit of a nuisance or a bit of a barrier to progress. But if you're bringing your kid into the emergency department and I'm telling you, I've built an automated pathway, and so this machine's going to figure it out. It's going to be the most efficient, highest quality care you're going to get. But it's impacting your child that you're bringing in, right? Or your parent or whatever the situation is. You're going to want that system to have been heavily regulated and robust so that you can build that trust. And so how we go about regulating AI and machine learning, I think the making sure you have the right people at the table to represent all perspectives. I would advocate that our general population, non-experts, but the people who are going to utilize, particularly in a healthcare space, hospitals need to be at that table to give their opinion. And then beyond that, I leave that to maybe many of the people in the room who sit in that space. I'm going to be sort of in the bowels of the hospital treating children and building models to try and improve care, but I'll be looking to other experts to help guide me on that perspective.
And let's just keep going down the panel.
What I really like to talk about, I guess we did one of us actually talk about it, is fairness and bias in AI systems. And there is both risks and opportunity here. So first of all, we know that our current processes, processes that are run by humans, they are biased. It's not a secret. We know that we, as humans, we are racist, we are sexist, and it's not like a secret to us anymore. So, and most of the problems we have with AI and ML as well, when we talk about machine learning and AI, it can be biased, or it's because we are using human data. It's not because the mathematical optimization process can be biased. There is no way that the mathematical process can be biased, but it's mainly because we are using, as ingredients, we are using human data. We are using humans to label our data. And the other problem is the historical biases, historical problems we had in our societies. For example, it's not, when we talk about, for example, healthcare application, it's not about human behavior we're normally biased. It's mostly because, for example, we don't have enough data for people of color. So basically, our model is completely blind for people of, for minorities mainly. For example, for so many different problems, healthcare problems, we even don't have enough data for women. We have mostly data from males, which is kind of weird to me. But anyhow, the problem is that maybe, for example, when you talk about, first, I guess nobody has doubts that these machine learning systems also make errors. So we are not talking about something like this, 100% accurate. We know that these are actually, especially these systems, are probabilistic, and which means that because we are taking these probabilistic systems and using them in a deterministic decision making, actually the risk of error is even higher. And there is no way that we can make a kind of 100% accurate system anytime in the future, at least in my view. So basically, and when we talk about the systems errors, for example, we might, in so many applications, what I found out, for example, I talk about plagiarism detection. And that was the system I worked on. And we thought, okay, let's check our system against potential biases. For example, let's check if our system is a bias towards, for example, the students of certain background. And what we figured out, actually, when we were testing our system, is that our system is actually biased towards people who are not native speakers, who are not native English speakers. Why? Because historically, maybe I'm not an English native speaker, so I might not be very confident writing my own essay. So I have hired more contract cheaters. So and statistically in our data set we might have. So basically there is again correlation. I'm making grammatical errors because I'm not a native speaker, and at the same time people with similar backgrounds they might have. I have more data of these kinds of people making. Have cheated, for example, in our data set. So basically, the system gonna pick up my grammatical errors as kind of indications of cheating, because there is a correlation between people of my background and cheating. So basically, the system error, false positive rate for people of similar background to me is much higher. What does it mean? It means we're gonna accuse non-native speakers more often of cheating while they haven't cheated, right? So the fairness and bias, there is a problem we have to think about, whenever we are building AI system, we have to specifically think about how we can test our system against potential biases and how we can build solutions that are fair. And again, don't be discouraged. There is a technology, there are technologies, there are research going on that can help us to build fair systems. And that's, when we talk about governance, I really don't know who should own it. what I would advocate for is that each individual, each of us that are using these systems every day, we should have more awareness. We should ask the businesses. And that's why we have trust as our investment thesis, because we believe over time there's going to be more and more awareness about privacy, about fairness, about biases, and the winners of each market going to be the ones who has built that relation of trust with their customers.
Just really quickly, so what's really interesting, so you're talking about biases within the data, which is definitely, I completely agree with. And then let's say you're doing an error analysis on your model and you're trying to make sure across all different races of people, your model doesn't have an error rate that's particularly high in one subset, right? Well, here's the dilemma that I have, and I don't know how you're going to regulate this, is that I don't have race in our electronic health record system.
That was exactly the problem I had.
It doesn't even exist. So in the US they do, because they want to make sure that care is equally distributed. In Canada, we just never thought of that problem, I guess. And so, how do I then implement a model when I can't even conduct the error analysis that I want to say, yes, this is definitely fair across all populations. So it's a real challenge to do that.
Brilliant point. And that's why I always encourage that we should, normally when we talk about PIIs, personally identified information, especially I was in a panel last year exactly in the same conference, and I was in the panel with a couple of people from banks. And they were like, we're gonna, for the privacy reasons, we don't want to give access to our data scientists. PIIs should be completely removed from data. And I told them, no, at least provide some sorts of API that they can just make queries. Data scientists, they can make queries. Or what I did, for example, I talk about that plagiarism detection software. Also, Turnitin, they don't also hold any information. They don't keep any PII from, they don't have any information about race, ethnicity, religion, or anything like that from their student. So in this case, I tried to be pretty creative and said, okay, I have their names. And names, for example, they can be pretty good proxies for race and gender, right? So I can just use, and there are lots of dictionaries that I can use, and I can take potential, and then these are proxies. They don't need to be 100% accurate, but they're, or for example, location. Location also can be a good proxy of your race or your ethnicity, at least in Toronto. So there are lots of potential ways that you can be creative, even if you don't have those kinds of PII informations.
Well, and it's such a sage point. Data scientists and these machine learning engineers are going to find ways to infer these data points anyways.
Exactly, yeah.
So I think I'm of the opinion actually of almost ubiquitously open data and choice and context. I would like to be able to choose how my data is used, in what context. I'd like to give it away for useful applications, but then also know what the error rates are. So, I would almost be interested too in exploring, let's say an example of misclassification. Should there be fines? Should there be penalties? Should we know? What if I'm not approved for a mortgage based on a proxy location feature that's been generated? What are, and it wouldn't be that clearly separatable, but what are our thoughts on that?
Is there any fine for officers now? Because we know human error is now there, right? And we can only, for me, the best case scenario is that we aim for a better misclassification error, better than humans. So it's just one step ahead. I really don't want to get to 100. I don't want to be perfectionist, especially when we are talking about machine learning systems. So it's only supposed to be better than humans, or it is better, or it is supposed to make humans more efficient or more aware about their potential, about the potential errors they can make, right?
Yep. Michael, Vic, thoughts on regulation and ownership?
Sure, I'll go first because this is a big one in my industry, and probably on a step back. So what we are looking at, there are right now about 600 different metrics that companies are using to report on their environmental impacts. So what I think governments can do, and we're seeing it whether that's made, and to some case, I guess, businesses, things like stock exchanges, is standardized disclosure regimes. I'm along the same lines as you, that the data should be publicly available because that's where we're going to get the nuances, the different thought processes that you all have. Okay? The world needs a different operating system right now, and that is you guys. when we need it in about 20 years. But that's what we're looking at, is how to standardize some of these disclosure regimes anyhow, and then let the data scientists and AI work through it with however they want to pick and choose the information and or the results that they are targeting. And that's company-wise, and that's also one of the things that I was at the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative conference last month, and it's a overarching organization and standardized norms for the mining sector, extractive sector, oil and gas. And the two issues that they focused on this year was tax transparency, so public disclosure of all extractive contracts in the countries that are EITI compliant. And these are mostly sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. But putting up their oil concessions, their mining concessions for tax transparency purposes. And then the other was data mainstreaming. Putting out how do they get this data out there publicly available, because not all of them have it's nice that we sit here and talk about machine learning in the bowels of SickKids, but there are countries that don't have even the data, the infrastructure, the internet infrastructure. Right? They're still building mobile networks, and there are people that don't have access to the internet. And that's part of where mining, being usually in those jurisdictions are close, can supply, because they need their own internet access for the logistics purposes and their management, and then extend that to the communities that they're operating in. So I sort of take back a little bit of and it's open contracts, it's open disclosure. I'm all for that, and as long as the information is somewhat scrubbed, so you can't identify personalities, and maybe has a decay function to it, that it evaporates after a certain use or time period, but allow the data analysts and the AI machine learning to come out and extract what it can from it, and that's where we're better if we're all learning and sharing and talking, as opposed to having to think inside a certain way.
Yeah, so generally when it comes to policy around making regulations, what happens is there's two schools of thought right now. So one school of thought is that AI is sort of like the new electricity, so it really shouldn't be regulated as a special class of technology, because pretty much then you're going to end up regulating every single thing that it touches. The other school of thought is that, well, AI has the potential to impact negatively certain things, whereby it should be regulated as a special class of technology. So there's a lot of debates going on there. But irrespective of that, in some sense, regulations typically emerge from one of two things. One thing is that there is a constant, incremental, iterative process where the people that are governed deal with their government, and then there's all types of good ideas coming up from the bottom up, and all kinds of interesting regulations are proposed, and then they're voted on, and eventually they're enacted. The other thing is, when something catastrophic happens, then everybody talks about it, and all of a sudden there is a leapfrogging, transformational, radical sort of a regulatory intervention. And a good example of that is when you think about, without naming names, but when you think about autonomous vehicles, and this is an area I focus on quite a bit at Mars, and I deal with a lot of different companies that are building autonomous vehicles technologies, whether they be in the car, whether they be the smart infrastructure, or the vehicle to something communications, vehicle to infrastructure, or vehicle to vehicle, is a lot of the times they're always thinking about what regulation is going to come in that first category, which is incremental, iterative, slow thinking, kind of methodical kind of regulation. But then every now and again you hear a news story that some autonomous vehicle hit somebody and there was an accident, and sadly sometimes there's been loss of life. And so that then accelerates the desire for, rightfully so, on the part of the people, to want regulation of these autonomous vehicle technologies. And so really there's this some of it is predictable. So some of these entrepreneurs, they're already looking at the evolution, the incremental, iterative evolution of autonomous vehicle regulations, and trying to make business plans around that. But then also in the back of their mind, they're cognizant of the fact that something catastrophic, something dramatic might happen somewhere, and that may then precipitate this major push for an overhaul of the regulatory regime, or some massive, radical, transformational change into the regulatory apparatus. So that really, I think, that is something that, whether you're you're the business person on one end of it, you're the citizenry that's being impacted by it, or you're the regulators who are actually making the policies and regulating. This is sort of the creative tension you have to deal with, is you have to sort of tease out and disambiguate where the edges are of these two types of change makers, if you will, when it comes to regulation, and then be able to resolve them and solve them in a creative way.
Great. So at this point, we're going to dive into a little bit of Q&A, or so I've been told. I don't know. Do we have mic runners? Yeah, we do. Great. Looks like we have one there on the right.
Hi, thank you. If we look at data governance across the board, borders, we're looking at different models emerge. You've got people in Europe, their regulation is pretty much ahead of the curve, whereas here in North America with the Cambridge Analytica and the FACE, is it called FACE app, the story that broke this week, the government is scrambling to come up with regulations while also trying to allow the companies to utilize data to drive value. And then we've got the model in China where the government can be really invasive, where there's very little regulation. So if we can zoom out a little bit, like 10 years, 20 years down the road, what do you think these emerging models what effect will it have on how we think about data? Thank you.
I mean, let's all jump in, but for me, this is a passion area. So I would say it's about choice. I think it's about the choice of an individual in the context. So I might choose to give away some piece of information to get a nice selfie of what I'll look like when I'm 80, but that's my choice. And I need to know how that information is being used, if it's being monetized, if it's being shared, what permissions do I have on that? You know, privacy and data use and information is deeply personal and contextual, and I might be willing to give away my photos of myself for that, but I might not be willing to give them away for a medical app. And I should have that right to decide the context in which and circumstances under which I can share and also revoke my consent for my information. So that to me is like, you know, utopia. I don't know if we have thoughts.
Also on choice, I think that's a very interesting thing. There was a study that came out. There's a number of surveys done where when people are asked in the abstract about privacy, everybody's all for privacy. I'm all for privacy. Yes, let me have all my privacy protections and safeguards and regulations, etc. But then when people are asked to click on a 20-page end-user license agreement on a software or a mobile app, what do you think they do? They click it right away. So I think choice is very important, is that people don't, as a whole, think about privacy as this homogeneous, monolithic construct. Everybody has different views on what privacy means to them, and it changes over time. It's ultimately a trade-off between convenience and your right to be, shall we say, private.
Right. But then that long user agreement doesn't enable choice in an effective way, right? So,
and with GDPR now, there is that notion where you can have checkboxes, supposedly.
right.
But you're right.
Yeah.
Yes.
To be more transparent about the choice that you think you're making, I think is important up front.
My ideal case is to have a trusted entity between me and the external world. And basically that trusted entity tells me, so basically it's like a broker for my data. And that trusted entity, I will provide my high level kind of priorities to that trusted entity, and I don't need to read all 100 pages of those consents that I have to every time sign, and even the language is not accessible for me. So basically that trusted entity, based on my priorities, based on my values, decides who should get access to my data and who shouldn't, which applications should I use based on my values and priorities, which applications I shouldn't use. The Face app, for example, application, immediately when I saw so many, it's mainstream, I decided, oh, I'm not going to use it. And lots of people argue that it's only about your pictures, but most of the time when you allow these apps, they get access to your contacts, they get access to your, so many information you have on your cell phone, for example. So it's about, again, it's about awareness. We have to increase the individual awareness, but at the same time, we are all very busy individuals. We can't spend 3 hours per day reading all these pages of consents and privacy information to decide should we use a single app or not. So that's why I think in the future we need to have more of those trusted entities.
And I think trust is the operationalization here. and you can construct trust. And I come from a derivatives background, so that is sort of the way I approach looking at things. What's the derivative? And what is trust made of, and how do you construct it? And I think on this data privacy issue, again, it's the how do you construct it with who has your data, or I like this idea on the broker side, because you advance through transactional interactions to then how is it being applied. So I think that is the relationship, and it starts with the individual and it moves outward as the trust is gained on who has got access to it or how it is being used. But it is you as the end user or the person or actually the source of the privacy, then that it's incumbent upon us to do that and make that aware. And I go back to governments and policy decisions, and that is the standardization of disclosure requirements, I think is the way to go. We don't need them to tell us what to do. It's just sort of set the framework that allows us to develop the way that we want to or that we're going to or society has decided. And I think the constructing trust with your own data and who gets it and how it's used advances depending on your satisfaction, and at any point in time it can be withdrawn.
Whoever was, oh, there we go.
Hi, my name is Lily, and I've been working in strategic funding, strategic communication for the philanthropic sector. And my question is also for Terry from CIBC. We need data analytics for philanthropy, for sure. We have been repeating that for many, many years, but we're still in the 80s. I see a lot of issues. First, donors don't want to share their personal information to other foundations in a very competitive market. Sometimes they just want to have their information on one foundation. So how do you tackle that kind of issue? And how do you tackle the issue that I see many like small companies in analytics creating their own thing and trying to sell their value to foundation without having like a collective intelligence?
Where's Terry?
Well, I can sort of address that first. That is, I think it comes down to, and again, and I'll maybe abstract it a bit, but this is the impact assessment and impact awareness and quantification, being able to say as the philanthropic organization, this is how we intend to use the data analytics. And again, I go back to that sort of baseball analogy. What is the good and how do you spin the good up? We're really good and using negative feedback creates a nice stable equilibrium. And that is not necessarily the best place to be all the time. What we need to do is try to, how do we spin these things going forward? So I've been engaged in how to extrapolate and start to look at what is like the question of a dollar saved now and what does it look like used inside a nice operating environment or for good. So taking that $1, and we can maybe talk later on, but taking that dollar now that goes into analytics at your organization or from your donor and saying this is how we can extrapolate this and not using linear and discount factor models because they have issues with those. But what does it, how does it grow and grow into something even larger than any of the models that we've got with the positive impact? So I think it comes down to, you know, I don't want to say it's the, it should be incumbent upon the AI and the analytics pitch to say here is what we can forecast or what we reasonably forecast or can expect from $1 now and what it's going to look like and what it's going to do for you in the future, as opposed to, you know, and I understand the sensitivity on the donor side that they want to see their dollars impact, and this is, it's the counterintuitive argument, right? You're asking for, they're asking for the result post hoc. And we haven't got there yet. It's what's the cost of not doing something is another way to phrase it. So I think that's where it is, and there's some good models, I think, being developed, and I've started thinking about this as well, predicting what things are going to look like in the future using a networked approach and a couple of mechanical engineering formulations. But I think that's it. What's the impact? It's the impact assessment, and there's a lot of work going on the impact investing side, on the predicting how your dollars grow or philanthropic donations grow over time. The idea of a social millionaire, comes to mind, and what's it going to look like, or what's it going to take? I've presented this idea on activating CSR budgets from mining companies. Let's say, well, we built a school and we supplied 100 blankets. And I said, that's great, but what have you done and what's it going to be like down the road? So when you built the hospital, how many people are employed and how many people did it serve? And if we extrapolate that over 40 years, then all of a sudden you've served 500 people that didn't have access to medical care, provided 3 jobs on an ongoing basis, so that's another 25 people. So here's what your impact has been. And converting it, one, maybe out of the dollars, and then back into the dollars.
Perfect. So thanks for your questions. Thank you very much to our panelists. This is a great discussion, and I'm sure you'll be asked lots of questions out in the lobby. But for now, we're going to hand it back and transition to the next panel. Great.
Thank you all very much. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate it.